In our last lecture, we saw that Marx believed that inherent within capitalism are certain problems, and that the conflict between the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the proletariat, that these two groups, the conflict between these two groups, was going to build to such a state that capitalism was going to disintegrate. The foundation of this problem is what Marx called the exploitation of workers. What he meant by that was that workers were seen as a means to an end. They were an input into production like any other input into production. And so workers became just another input to be used and abused and absorbed and all of that. Now, let's say you agreed to work for me for 15 hours. Your workday is going to be 15 hours, and in payment for that 15 hours worth of labor, I'm going to pay you $150. So 15 hours of work, $150. Now you start working, and at 10 hours, you produce $150 worth of goods. Let's say water bottles. So at 10 hours, you've produced $150 worth of water bottles. This is what Marx calls socially necessary labor. It's the labor needed to produce enough good to equal your wage. Now, after that 10 hours, just because you've produced as much value as your wage, you can't go home. You had agreed to work 15 hours for me. So it's this last 5 hours in which you create a profit for me as the boss. Your first 10 hours, you created your wage. The next 5 hours, you're creating profit for me. This last 5 hours, Marx calls surplus labor. It's the labor that creates the profit. Now, in theory, socially necessary labor and surplus labor are not necessarily bad or good. Where surplus labor becomes a problem is that with surplus labor, the worker has no say where that profit goes. This profit goes into my pocket. I control what happens to it. Now, for Marx, that's exploitation. That's somebody using you, abusing you, working you, and not giving you a say in what happens. The fact that you create a product, you create value, and I, in a way, steal it from you. This is not a situation that would be class harmony. Remember, Smith believed there was class harmony. There was harmony between the two groups in society, and that market forces would make sure, if we were not kind enough to each other, market forces would make sure that there was class harmony. Smith didn't believe there was exploitation because of the invisible hand and all of that other stuff. But Marx is saying, let's get real here. You're asking people to work 15 hours a day. Only a portion of it do they get the value of what they created. There is a portion of the day in which value virtually is stolen from the worker. Now, what makes it worse, it's bad enough that workers are forced to work the surplus labor hours. What makes it worse is that capitalists do everything in their power to shrink the socially necessary labor. They bring in more machines, which make us work faster. They do whatever they can to make sure that you reproduce your wage in less and less time. So if I were to move this line down, the socially necessary labor time shrinks. But what happens to the surplus labor time? The surplus labor time increases. So it's in my best interest as a capitalist to shrink the socially necessary labor in order to increase the surplus labor. And this, for Marx, is really the foundation of exploitation, of using workers badly. Workers don't have a say in what they, how they do their job. The capitalist insists on telling them how to do their job, takes value away from them, value that they create. Remember, prior to capitalism, production was done in what we call cottage industries. People worked at home. They did the product from start to finish. Now, we see when we looked at division of labor and Smith that was not necessarily efficient. But from Marx's perspective, it was good because workers then controlled the value they created, the goods they created. Capitalism may work more efficiently, but it's at a cost. It takes away value from the workers. So workers become marginalized. They become another input into production, and we try to squeeze as much work out of them as possible. And when they're done, we throw them away and we get a new worker. All right. Now, for Marx, this was inefficient. This was bad. Had another system that was going to be built up only to be ripped apart. And so for Marx, he wanted us to get rid of capitalism, and we needed to put in place a system that would not have internal conflicts with it. And that process would be a two-step process. Now, in order to get to a perfect society, in Marx's point of view, we have to do two steps. The first step, once we overthrow the capitalist system, would be to impose socialism. And socialism defined as an economic system under which the means of production are owned publicly. They are owned by society as a whole. They are controlled by society as a whole. Now, the reason why Marx argues we have to do that comes back to the idea of us being a product of our environment. The government needs to take over control and management of business, because you and I as workers are going to need to concentrate on thinking about society first. Under capitalism, you and I think of ourselves first. And Smith was okay with that. Smith, remember, believed acting in our own self-interest was a good thing. Because from Smith's perspective, if we do what's in our own best interest, that will be in the best interest of society. We will go to the good society, in Smith's view, if we all do what's in our own best interest. Marx argues that's backwards. Marx believes that we must think of society first, make decisions based on what's good for society, because if it's good for society, then it's good for me as an individual. And so during socialism, you and I are going to learn how to think that way, to think of society first, to put society first. And so in order to change society, we have to change the way we think. In order to change the way we think, we have to change society. So they have to kind of go together. Now, once the majority of us, the vast majority of us, start thinking about society first, then we can go to communism, which for Marx is the final step. The difference between socialism and communism is that under communism, the government would return control of production over to the workers. And so if you worked in a water bottle factory, everybody who worked in that water bottle factory would have a say in how the profits for that water bottle factory were used. There would still be surplus labor, but this surplus labor under communism would not be exploitive because the workers now had a say where it went, how we used it. Did we give bonuses to all of the workers? That's a use of the profit. Did we plow the profit back into the company? Did we all agree that that was best? Or is there a situation in which maybe we should be lending that money to another company completely because society needs what they're producing and they don't have the opportunity to expand? They don't have enough money to do that. All right. So under communism, we would have all of those things that Marx thinks are good. Everybody would have access to basic needs. Everybody would have a say in all of the aspects of their life. There would be no exploitation of workers. Everybody would be a worker. Everybody would be equal. There would be no internal conflicts within this society to make it unstable, like all of those other societies that have gone before. And there would be no need to overthrow this system. This system would be so good. Now, Marx actually believed that the worker revolution to overthrow capitalism would happen in an industrialized society. He believed the United States, England, Germany would be those societies where it would be ripe for a revolution. I don't think he ever would have envisioned Russia or China as being countries that would have these, because they never got to capitalism. They were overthrowing feudal societies. And so he just probably would not have understood the revolution in those countries. But why haven't workers in the capitalist countries gotten so fed up with the system that they've tried to overthrow it? Why hasn't that happened? I don't have an answer for you, but it's something that you should think about. What has changed? Is the capitalism that you and I live under today the same capitalism that Marx saw? I personally would argue no. I think there have been changes. And so that may account for why capitalism hasn't fallen. But I don't know. I hope you've enjoyed looking at Marx because it gives us a different perspective on the economy. In our next lecture, we're going to move back to the traditional economists and how a market society works. Hey, maybe we're stuck with a market. Let's learn how it works.